So the phenomena of nose blindness is pretty weird and interesting too. You walk into a space and it has a weird smell or a nice smell or just a novel smell that you weren't smelling a moment ago. And then 10 minutes later or so, you can't smell it anymore. Now, this principle expands to more than just the phenomena of adapting to smells, but it's the one that's the most common in the zeitgeist, so I chose to lead with that. It actually happens also with, like, brightness. You walk into a dark room or a light room, or you put a piece of tape on your eyebrow. Like any abnormal change in your qualia state space, in your experiential content, that after an amount of time just sort of fades into the realm of not being processed anymore, even though initially it was a dramatic enough change to be noteworthy to enter your mind. And it's interesting because once you realize the existence of this principle, it starts to appear pretty much everywhere. The place that it appears the most would be the largest context, existence itself. Like, you often take for granted that you have a hand and it is the shape of the hand that it is, and it has these flat, rounded, hard bits on the end. Like the properties of your general day-to-day existence, the fact that you have to breathe, the fact that you have to sleep, the fact that you have to exist under and within the parameters that you exist under and within. Those things don't often register in terms of like active thought. And I think that this ultimately comes down to like 60 million years ago, a rodent in the jungle didn't necessarily need to process every breath it was taking, the trees around it, the sky above it in most states, nor the general environment it was in. It was more about like spending limited neurological resources on pinging those things which stand out from the average, as well as those things which are evolutionarily relevant to any given species. That thing over there is moving, and it can eat me. That plant over there has these particular colors, and I'm wired to be attracted to them because those are the colors of the plant that can sustain me and the shapes of a plant that can sustain me. And this process, selected for by the necessity of thought prioritization in a circumstance of limited resource availability, carved into us an ambient blind spot for the normal things, the things which are the most consistent and stable, relative to the whole. I've spoken of this concept a bit before, but it's so pervasive and all-consuming that I thought it was worth its own titled video. It's interesting because it comes into play a lot with regards to things like belief systems or values or possessions or relationships. Essentially, it's the phenomenon of taking things for granted, but on the level that you just don't think about or consider the phenomena involved, the reasoning behind, the chronology of the reasons for a given thing that has had a presence in your life for some time. Now, as I said before, the biggest thing that's in the blind spot, the foundation of the blind spot itself, would be existence outright. And in this, I mean to say that how I conceptualize absurdism comes down a lot to the complete removal of the normalization blind spot from your active day-to-day framework. And it's funny because you also see it in things like companies and how they attempt to manipulate the psychology of the population. Ever notice that the mustard's getting smaller? Or the ketchup or whatever. The container, they make it just a little bit smaller, then a little bit smaller, then a little bit smaller, and they do that over like 5 to 10 years to the point where like it stands out a little bit, but it's only a little bit of an adjustment, so it doesn't stand out much. And then time goes on, it's normalized, and then another one happens, and then time goes on and it's normalized. So they essentially rely on the fact that over time the mind just sort of accepts whatever state that it's been put in as normal, and then utilize that to the ends of making points in the points game. But on a more foundational level, and on the level that I think is the most important to discuss with regards to the impact that it has, I would highlight the role that it plays within the dimension of values and beliefs. It is more often than not the case that the values we end up holding when we're developed sentient organisms are values that just were sort of around us when we developed. We don't think about why we hold them, we don't think about the reasoning behind how they came to be, we don't think about really the content or the implications. We just sort of hold these values because that's what we were taught to do, and those around us were doing so too. It was and is normal, at least in our localized pocket. What's normal, what is in that blind spot, changes drastically from environment to environment. People can be normalized to, and therefore take granted, really wonderful things, but people can also be normalized to terrible things, which I guess is good. And it's funny because essentially confronting the blind spot gives us that uncomfortable feeling of confronting ignorance or uncertainty, which feels uncomfortable because we were literally selected against exhibiting those traits and behaviors. So entire systems of thought and corners of philosophy essentially unknowingly revolve around shielding the mind from having to confront the normalization blind spot. The biggest and most obvious one being the God idea. What? Existence isn't absurd and incomprehensibly complicated? God did it. Anyway, I didn't want this one to go on too long, and this is a bit different from my normal format. I'm going to try experimenting a bit more with shorthand content like this, just highlighting a specific concept, unscripted, of which this is the first attempt.